Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Lanning, and tonight I'll be presenting a pattern for FlowRouter authentication and authorization. I apologize, my voice is a little scratchy, I'm just getting over a cold. First, a little bit about myself. I am co-founder of Share 911, a startup which has been using Meteor in production for about 3 years. I maintain the roles authorization package, and I am one of the co-organizers of the Meteor New York meetup group. So the other day, I went to my favorite pub, and who did I see behind the bar but my favorite bartenders, IronRouter and FlowRouter. So went up to the bar, IronRouter comes over, "Yo Adrian, how you doing? What would you like to drink?" "I'm feeling a little bit manly today, so hey, give me a whiskey." Check out who else is at the bar, see some friends, turn back. What is this? IronRouter has brought 20 whiskeys and put them on the bar in front of me and give me a bill for $200. Something is obviously not going right here. Alright, we can roll with this. Call some friends over, help distribute the wealth here. We're having a good time. Yeah, I think it's about time for another drink. "Yo, FlowRouter, hook me up, man. Can I have another whiskey?" FlowRouter comes over, thinks about it, takes a look at me, says, "Nope, screw you," kicks me out. Alright, so that's the end of the joke. I know it's a bit lame, but if you've worked with FlowRouter or IronRouter, you may have come across these cases of reactivity gone wrong. So, getting right into the meat of the talk, there are two main routers in Meteor, IronRouter and FlowRouter, and the main difference between them is IronRouter supports reactivity and FlowRouter does not. Now this is on purpose. I believe that the authors of FlowRouter did this because of the performance problems that can often arise when you have reactivity in your routes. Now, I do want to say that I believe anything you can do in FlowRouter, you can also do in IronRouter. IronRouter is not forcing you to put reactivity in your routes, but it does allow you to. So that being said, I think that IronRouter is actually a bit easier to get started with, and at this point it does have more package support, although that will be changing over time. So it turns out that one of the really useful functions of reactivity in routes is access control. So what do we mean by access control? Well, there's two terms for access control. There's two different types of access control. Authentication, which is who are you, and authorization, which is now that the client and the server have agreed on who you say you are, what is it that you have permission to do. So in the package ecosystem, the accounts password and the OAuth accounts packages handle authentication, and the roles package or other similar packages handle authorization for you. So the reason that it's really useful to have reactivity in your routes is because authentication and authorization is a handshake. It takes time. It doesn't just immediately occur when the client first connects to the server. So here is a sequence diagram outlining a basic connection. The way sequence diagrams work, time starts in the top left, and then the further down you go, that's how time advances. So you can see that in the initial request, there is no meteor.user on the client. It's actually null. And then over time, these values get changed, and on the server side, this.user ID in your publish functions becomes usable, and then eventually you have your authentication, your user is authenticated and authorized with her appropriate permissions. But you can see that this is actually happening over time. So it's really nice to be able to have your routes decide or rerun as as these things are filled in for you. But it turns out that you can actually do the same kind of thing in templates themselves, and that's actually what FlowRouter requires. So the reason that FlowRouter made this decision to require template-based reactivity is because you can get yourself into trouble if you do this kind of thing directly in the route. And that's because in a lot of the examples in IronRouter that I've seen in the wild, you'll have a page that will basically just say loading or connecting while these things are happening. And that's not really ideal from a user's experience point of view. What happens is you have a perceived performance problem. Whereas if you take a more template-based approach, you can actually have templates that don't require the user to be logged in being displayed, while the specific template that does require the authorization or authentication can be doing its thing. So from a user's perspective, the more that they see happening on the screen quicker, the faster the page is actually perceived. Now, before we go on, I did want to mention there is some misinformation out there regarding triggers and FlowRouter. I've seen people say that you can do similar checks, access control checks in triggers, but that is not an appropriate way to do it. You're going to run into problems if you do that. And that's because triggers are not reactive, and IronRouter himself chimed in on this and was very explicit in saying that template-based is the way to go. All right, so let's take a look at some example applications and the difference between route-based and template-based. So what we've done with the Meteor roles package is we actually have the same app created with different router packages. So it started back with router, and then mini pages came along, but those are deprecated now. And IronRouter is kind of the parent or the child of those routers. And we'll take a look first at IronRouter. Just happen to have used the route-based definition here for IronRouter. You could actually use template-based access control with IronRouter as well. So we'll scroll down to the bottom here. IronRouter has this concept of filters. You can have before filters and after filters. And one of the filters, the way that I've designed it, is called authenticate. So let's take a look at what that does. It's just a function that uses some reactive variables to check certain things about the user. And it will load different templates based on the status of the user's reactive variables here. So this is kind of nice because it's all in one spot, and it's pretty simple, and it's actually reactively rerun when the user's information from that as that authentication handshake goes on. So that's pretty nice. Now let's take a look at the FlowRouter case, where we've actually implemented template-based access control. And if we scroll down here, we see, wow, that is super simple. There's basically just what is your main layout and what is your template. So where is our access control actually happening? It turns out that it's happening in our main layout. So you can see these are actually the same checks we were doing on the other side. It's just we're doing it in our template instead of in the route. Now, this has some ramifications, which we'll get into, but I did want to give an example or show at least what the app is doing. We can see here is a manage users example user. So if we log in, we'll see we have access to the manage users page and also the data, which is important. Then if we sign back out, we'll sign in as a user with the secrets permission. Then we don't have access to the manage users page, but we do have access to this other page called secrets. So yay, it's working like it should. And I don't remember if this is the actual FlowRouter or IronRouter example, but the UI and everything is basically the same. All right, so that was the simple demo. And I want to mention that the FlowRouter side of, or the FlowRouter router itself has this great guide that if you scroll down here, you can click on implementing auth logic and permissions. And we go over a lot of what we were just talking about with the template side. Here's a link to those examples, or at least the FlowRouter one. And if we scroll down here, we see we've implemented the auth logic inside the individual templates. However, depending on your app, it's not really practical to do that, because what you'll end up happening is you'll have the authentication logic be duplicated in a bunch of different layouts. We can see if we go back here to our FlowRouter example, in our routing, we are reusing the same main layout for all these access things. But if we wanted to actually have different checks in the layout, say we didn't want to give access to this page unless we actually have the secrets permission, or the same here, if we didn't want to give access to this page unless we actually have the manage users permission, we would have to do a separate layout for that in order for that to happen, which is not ideal, because then you have duplicated logic, right? So you've got your authentication, which is the same between all the different layouts, but your authorization, which needs to be different, is what's causing you to have to duplicate those checks throughout. So that's simple, but it is not really ideal. So what is a better pattern is what I've come to use Auth Controllers, which basically means your layout will handle your authentication checks, but your specific, you have these kind of wrapper templates which handle your authorization. So this is like, what do you have permission to access? And even though in this diagram it's only one level, you can actually nest templates as deep as you want. So this is just a naming convention, Auth Controller. Really all we're doing is using a separate wrapper template. But the cool thing is that Meteor allows you to do that. So let's take a look at a more advanced demo. And while we're at it, we'll check out a more modular directory structure as well. So we'll go back over to our examples and check out the advanced demo. So right away we can see that our directory structure looks different. We have our main, manage users, and secrets sections. And you'll notice that these parallel the basic parts of our application. So main looks pretty standard. We have our route, we have our main layout. Take a look at that. Yep, here's our route, main layout, just like our regular simple app, a FlowRouter example. And here we can see we have the same authentication checks going on. But what's more interesting is when we go to manage users. Now we have client server under manage users, which is really cool because that means we can kind of have packages of sections of our app, like areas of our app. We can treat them kind of like packages within our app code, which is cool. But under the client here, we have routing, we see the controller, and then this is our actual template. So let's take a look at the route. We have, it looks a little different, right? We still have the main layout, which is handling our authentication. But now we've had this addition of this managed controller, which is our auth controller that's handling the authorization for us. And then this concept of a target template of what eventually we will be rendering. So the reason that this works is because Blaze actually will pass along this data context to child templates, which is really useful. So let's take a look at our managed controller. Super simple here. All we're doing is dynamically rendering whatever this result is, and turns out this is actually a helper function where we are doing a very simple auth check and either passing through what was declared in our route, or going 404, and you could have as much logic here as you want. Similarly, if we look at the secret side, we see an identical structure, just using a different controller, and the controller itself is doing different authorization checks. So you could imagine a separate route, maybe add secrets, where we reuse the same controller because the auth checks are the same, but we just target a different end template, maybe one where you let users add secrets, assuming they have the proper permissions. So what is really cool about that is we get nice nice UI here with no duplication of code. So here we have access to manage users. We don't actually have access on the nav to the secrets, but say somebody comes in here and types it in directly, now we're actually going to get a 404. Whereas with a simpler app, you would have to code this specifically to do that in each template, which is a hassle. Or you could just let them see the actual page and let your publish methods not send down the data. So it's not necessarily a security risk, because your server-side publish can still do the same checks that it needs to do. But it's actually nicer from a user's perspective, a UI perspective, to tell users, hey, what's going on? You don't have permission to see this page. Either it does not exist, or you don't have permission to access it. So that's pretty cool. And you can take that as far as you want. These examples are all online. You can find the slides online. And that is pretty much the end of the talk. We'll go over here. In summary, we looked at access control in Meteor. What is it? Authentication and authorization. The existing ways that people do that, and a nice pattern for reuse. And I wanted to mention that a pattern is not really a pattern if only one person does it. A pattern is something that people recognize as a common way to do this. So even after I presented this before, people came up and were like, yeah, I use that pattern. So this is kind of a recognition that it does exist. Other people have independently found this kind of pattern, and I've actually heard that it works whether or not you're using Blaze or React. So even in React, where you don't have these kind of templates, you do have components. And it's nice to have a wrapper component that takes care of authorization checks for you, and then have your actual widget component that does the work that you want it to do. So I hope it's been helpful. I enjoyed putting this together, and you can find more at this this URL with the slides here, or you can go to my GitHub, which has Meteor roles and the examples that you can check out, or you can shoot me an email. So, all right, thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.